Hello, good afternoon. We will start in 2 minutes because I can see the number of participants increasing. So yeah, we are ready, but we will start in 2 minutes. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome. Yeah, we will start in 2 minutes because I can see some people joining. So yeah, we will wait 1 or 2 minutes more and we will start. Oh, good afternoon. Yeah, we will start in 1 minute. Okay, so yeah, so I think that we can start. So hello everyone and welcome to our today's webinar. I'm Didier Sampere, working in the Aventor company in the global marketing team. My role is really to push and promote all the chemicals in our portfolio all around the world. And today, I'm sure you will agree with me that water determination by Karl Fischer method is certainly one of the most common methods in the analytical labs. But to perform in this complex method, you need to use different parameters. And in this webinar called Get the Most Out of Your Karl Fischer Titration, Allison Reiter from Thermo Scientific will share the best practices in Karl Fischer titration, which will be, I'm sure, really helpful in your future moisture content results. So after this webinar, I'm personally convinced that you will be more confident and you will avoid some usual mistakes. So now, before moving to the webinar, if you want to ask a question, please use the box questions. You can write the question and we will try to answer at the end of this webinar. So now I have a great webinar and Allison, up to you to start.
Perfect. Thank you, Didier. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss Karl Fischer titration. Always an exciting topic. We're going to review some general background today, as well as some tips to help you get the most out of your water content determination. This is always an interesting subject. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you with it today. As Didier mentioned, my name is Allison Reiter. I am the offering manager at Honeywell, responsible for our research chemicals product line. And within that, that includes our Karl Fischer titration reagents. Okay, as a very high-level summary, today we're going to start by reviewing just some brief history about Karl Fischer titration, and then we're going to dive straight into what we're all here for. So some tips, tricks, as well as some advice to help us get the most out of our Karl Fischer titration. This is a very broad category. There's plenty of things we could dive into. So today we're really going to focus on the reagent system and how you can work with your reagent system to improve your Karl Fischer titrations. Of course, there's topics with instrumentation as well as some other auxiliaries that we'll mention, but like I said, we're going to stay focused on the reagents here today. Then we'll wrap up with a little bit of a recap about what we learned, and I'll leave you with some resources that you can use after this webinar. Then, as Didier mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session. Please feel free to put those questions in as you think about them. Anything we don't get to, of course, we'll follow up and get your question answered after the session. And without any delay, let's just get started here. So Karl Fischer titration. What is Karl Fischer titration? It is a water content determination method that is named after its discoverer, Karl Fischer himself, shown over here on the right-hand side of this slide. Karl Fischer was a petrochemist working in the early 1900s, and he was tasked with searching for a method to determine the water content actually in sulfur dioxide. As he was trying to figure out a way to do this, he remembered the Bunsen reaction shown on the screen, which is between iodine and sulfur dioxide in an aqueous medium. He actually discovered that he could modify this reaction to determine water content in a non-aqueous system that would contain an excess of sulfur dioxide. In his very first reagents that he created, he used methanol as the solvent, still commonly used today, and pyridine as the buffering agent, as he discovered that this reaction is pH dependent. While the discovery of a method to determine water content in a sample was quite exciting, these first Karl Fischer reagents that Karl Fischer himself created had several drawbacks. Both pyridine and methanol are a little bit toxic, and as I'm sure you all know, if you've come across pyridine in the lab, it smells horrible. So these reagents had to be used for many years until Dr. Eugen Schultz and Helga Hoffman, who were the researchers at Riedel del Hahn, replaced pyridine with imidazole and determined the Karl Fischer reaction mechanism that we know today. It's shown on the bottom of your screen here. It's a two-step reaction. So in the first step, we have a primary alcohol. So typically methanol, we have some ethanol-based reagents we can use as well, that reacts with sulfur dioxide to form a sulfurous acid of that alcohol. The acid then is neutralized completely by a base that's present in the reagent system. Like we mentioned, that base was originally pyridine. Most commonly now is imidazole, what Dr. Eugen Schultz and Helga Hoffman discovered. But we do have some imidazole-free reagents as well that we're going to talk a little bit more about. The product of that first reaction then is oxidized by iodine in the second step of our reaction mechanism. And it's in this process that you can see water gets consumed in a 1-to-1 stoichiometric ratio with iodine. So our equipment is actually registering and measuring iodine. We relate that in the 1-to-1 stoichiometric ratio with water. Hydranal, our original pyridine-free Karl Fischer reagents created by Dr. Eugen Schultz and Helga Hoffman, were introduced to the world in 1980, and that completely changed the world of Karl Fischer titration. So by changing from pyridine to imidazole, Karl Fischer titration, now it's safer, it's faster, much more accurate, much more stable reagents that we're using today. Innovations in this space haven't stopped. So you may be aware in 2015, imidazole, the base that's commonly used in most Karl Fischer reagents, was actually classified as a CMR substance, or carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic, by the European Commission. Hydranal has released a CMR-free reagent that has uncompromised performance. Traditionally, it was hard to find a base that would work as well as imidazole, not be slowing down our reagents, not be making them less accurate in any way. But we do have an imidazole-free option available now. And even more excitingly, we also just released the first Karl Fischer reagents to be completely free of alcohols. We're going to learn further on in this webinar why that's particularly important for certain samples. Now let's jump right in. Now that we've learned the history as well as the basic chemistry behind the Karl Fischer titration techniques, let's dive a little bit deeper into how we can be the most efficient in our technique and get the most accurate results possible. So Karl Fischer titration is a little bit unique. Unlike many other analytical techniques, it's really dictated by our actual sample being analyzed. Now, we learned that it's a quantitative water determination method. That means that it's going to give us a water content number. We're going to inject the sample, it's going to give us a number, but we need to be a little bit careful when interpreting our Karl Fischer results. That result may not actually be accurate depending on our sample's properties. We may need to think about oil samples, for example. We may need to qualify the water content in an oil sample, and that's not soluble in methanol by itself. Or maybe in a pharmaceutical sample, maybe we need to know the water content in a ketone, such as acetone, but we see the titration curve just going on and on and on, never reaching an endpoint. We know that there's a side reaction going on that we need to suppress. Or maybe, for example, we need to know the water content in a strong acid. That's going to be shifting the pH of our total working medium, potentially actually preventing the Karl Fischer reaction from taking place. But don't worry, today we're going to walk through several ways that we can get the most out of our titration across a variety of samples such as these, focusing on optimizing our reagent system. We're going to start right at the very beginning. So how do we choose the right type of Karl Fischer titration for our sample to give the most accurate results? And then we'll dive into some considerations that you may need to take depending on your sample itself. To begin with, we're going to review the two main types of Karl Fischer titration, as well as what types of samples each of those is suited for. Now, the two basic forms of Karl Fischer titration that we'll be considering are volumetric titration, where iodine's actually a part of our reagent system directly and is added to the titration cell from a burette, as well as coulometric titration, where iodine's actually generated electrochemically in the cell itself. When we're choosing between these two forms of titration, we're going to be considering the expected water content in our sample as one of the most important considerations. And our general rule of thumb here is that we'll recommend volumetric titration for samples with higher water content. So think, kind of in that 1% water all the way up to 100% water, although, you can measure a little bit lower as well. And for lower water content, we'll recommend coulometric titration. So think trace amounts of water, very low ppm levels, up to a couple percent of water, so as to not overwhelm the capacity of the reagents. The other major consideration between these two methods will be actually our sample's physical state. So as a theme you're going to see throughout the webinar today, volumetric titration is generally a little bit more flexible than coulometric titration. So we'll have, a little bit more options with what we can do with our samples, how we can manipulate them. And we'll see that first in the sample itself. So if you have a solid or a liquid sample, volumetric titration is appropriate, while coulometric titration we recommend only for liquid samples. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is in the coming slides. For the sake of time, we're not going to review it today, but be aware there's also a technique for Karl Fischer titration using a Karl Fischer oven system. So this is not necessarily a different technique, but it is a specialized equipment that gets paired with either one of these two types of cells, either a volumetric or coulometric titration cell. It's used mainly for samples that are either extremely hard to dissolve or that undergo side reactions with traditional Karl Fischer reagents that can't be prevented. Diving a little bit deeper into volumetric titration, as I mentioned, this is recommended for samples with a little bit higher water content. Actually, you can measure all the way up to 100%. However, you can also analyze samples down to almost 0.1% water. You'll just need to select a titrating agent with a low titer value to get the most accurate results. Also, as I mentioned, you've got a lot of flexibility with this system. In the next sections of this webinar, we're going to dive deeper into the ways that you can modify your solvent system to optimize titration for your sample. We have a lot of options here. We're going to talk about the addition of co-solvents to maximize sample solubility. We're going to talk about the use of buffers to keep the pH in the optimal range that you want it in. And we're going to talk about the reagent systems that you can use to inhibit side reactions with challenging samples. So think about those ketones that we mentioned briefly earlier. Like I mentioned too, be aware that you can also make modifications to the equipment side of this sample. So you can adjust temperature. The KF reaction actually will take place both at very low and very high temperatures. So you can use temperature to either inhibit side reactions or to promote solubility if needed. You can also attach additional equipment such as a homogenizer to better solubilize certain samples in the KF oven system that I mentioned earlier. Now, in coulometric titration, iodine, like I mentioned, is not directly part of the reagent system. It's actually generated in the titration cell itself. There are two types of these cells, those with a diaphragm that separate the anodic and cathodic compartments. So if we look at our little diagram over on the left-hand side, you'll see an A for the anodic compartment, a C for the cathodic compartment, and just that solid line at the bottom of the cathodic compartment. Sometimes there's a diaphragm there that actually physically separates those two compartments. Sometimes there isn't. For cells with a diaphragm, we generally recommend to use some specially formulated catholytes. The reason for this is that the composition of these reagents is a little bit different, so they're less prone to side reactions taking place at the cathode itself. This titration technique is extremely accurate, but it's a bit less flexible than the volumetric technique. It is not recommended for solid samples. The reason for this is that to get a solid sample into the cell, you actually need to physically, open up the cell rather than just injecting it in from a syringe. And with that, you're going to be bringing in a lot of atmospheric influence from the environment that you're in. So you can imagine that if you're detecting, ppm levels of water, if you're actually opening up that cell, you're going to get ppm levels of water just from the air around you. I mean, it's summer right now, it's very humid. You can almost feel the water in the air just by itself. With coulometric titration, we're also a little bit more limited with the co-solvents that we can use, although we do still have this option available to us for some samples that are quite hard to dissolve in methanol. Like I mentioned, in both techniques are going to be sensitive to the influence of the ambient environment, but especially for coulometric, since typically we're measuring samples with much lower water content. And so any error that would introduce would be much more impactful on an absolute level when we're talking about coulometric titration. Just think about our current conditions, hot and humid, so we really need to protect our analysis from reading moisture in the air. There's some ways that we can do that with technique. There's also some ways that we can do that just with best practices with the product itself. Okay, so now that we've covered the two main forms of Karl Fischer titration techniques, let's jump into some other techniques that we can use to get the most out of our titrations by actually tweaking our reagent system. First up, we're going to talk about sample solubility. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do I even care about sample solubility? Especially if I have a liquid, I'm just injecting the sample, I'm going to measure the water content. Well, for the majority of us, when we want to be measuring water content, we're interested in the total water that's contained within a sample. This is because this can have product shelf life, active ingredient activity, some side reaction down the line implications. So we care about the total water, not just the surface water present on the surface of the sample. If your sample doesn't actually dissolve well within methanol, which is the working media of most Karl Fischer titrations, you're not going to be getting an accurate water content number when you finish your titration if you're only analyzing the surface water. Because of this, we have some different methods that we can lean on to improve sample solubility and actually get to that true total water content value. We can add co-solvents, we can use temperature, as I mentioned, or even a homogenizer. Our options that are available to us are a little bit dictated by our method itself that we're using, either volumetric or coulometric. You'll remember that we have a bit more flexibility with total options to improve sample solubility when we're working in a volumetric system. But for both titration techniques, if you're facing challenges with sample dissolution, you could grind the sample. As is always important to keep in mind when doing our Karl Fischer titrations, we always want to avoid interaction with the ambient environment. So if you do need to grind your sample, don't use one of these mortar and pestles that's shown in this tiny picture in the right-hand corner of this slide. You're just going to be grinding up a bunch of water in the air into your sample when you're doing this. Always use a closed laboratory mill with a cooling jacket. Don't use this mortar and pestle. What we're going to be diving deeper into in the next couple of slides is what's bolded here, the addition of co-solvents. This is also a trick that's possible both with volumetric and coulometric titration. We're going to walk through some common co-solvents that we recommend for different types of samples, as well as some co-solvents that we want to avoid. As you remember, this is a technique where actually a chemical reaction is taking place. And so we need to be really careful that any co-solvents we introduce to our system don't throw off that stoichiometry and the selective reaction with water itself. We're not going to focus on the other sample solubility techniques listed here, but you can see they're available as a reference. So homogenizers, external water extraction, and of course that Karl Fischer oven that we mentioned earlier. If you recall our Karl Fischer reaction, you'll recall that a primary alcohol, typically methanol, is used as a working medium. Methanol is a great solvent for a lot of samples, but some do have poor solubility. So think about fats, oils, carbohydrates, for example. If we're working with any of these types of samples, simply injecting the sample into our methanol-based reagent system isn't going to allow us access to all of the water present in the sample, only that which is on the surface. The most common solvents that we use to improve sample solubility in Karl Fischer titrations are chloroform, which is a great solvent for lots of nonpolar substances, longer chained alcohols such as propanol, pentanol, etc. These are some of the most common, but you're not limited here. So we've had customers even use dodecanol before. We really want to stay with the primary alcohols here. On the next slide, we've got a chart that's going to kind of detail some of the samples and concentrations to use as well as those to avoid. But stick with the primary alcohols, don't go into secondary or tertiary alcohols, as those will interact with the reaction stoichiometry. We can also use toluene and xylene to improve the solubility of oil samples as well. And also formamide can be a great solvent for our carbohydrates, our proteins, as well as our inorganic salts. To save time with most of these, you can use pre-mixed working media that has the co-solvents blended in already. If these are samples that you're typically analyzing, such as the liposolver series, among others. You will need to remember, though, to always take some precautions when working with formamide. Due to its reactivity, we actually don't recommend pre-mixing this. We don't use it as a pre-mixed co-solvent. We do have it available as a solvent, but again, not pre-mixed, just work it up when you're ready to analyze your samples. So here's our promised chart here with some general rules to maximize sample solubility. We've got some technical reports available with additional information on this as well if you forget, but this is a really great one-pager to kind of keep to remember your general rule of thumb when working with any of these co-solvents. So as I mentioned, we've got our long-chain alcohols, our chloroform, our toluene, our xylene for some of our samples such as oils that are difficult to work with, and then our maximum recommended co-solvents to use when mixed with our reagent system here by technique. And so again, you'll see that rule of thumb. Generally, we've got a bit more flexibility with additions on the volumetric side. When we're working on the coulometric side, in general, we recommend using cells with a diaphragm when we're using co-solvents, except for in the case of formamide, and that's because formamide will actually migrate across the diaphragm itself and cause issues at the cathode. Then finally, at the bottom of this chart here, we've got a couple of options that we want to avoid. So in particular, a tricky one that we need to remember is we do want to avoid DMSO, the so-called universal solvent. This is actually not a good solvent for Karl Fischer. That's because we'll end up with recovery rates that are too low, and we have a lab report available on this if you're interested in the dirty details behind it. We also want to be avoiding DMF, and then as I mentioned, any secondary and tertiary alcohols. Basically, these may cause issues with the Karl Fischer reaction itself, which will then lead to incorrect water determination results. Okay, so that's a little bit on sample solubility. Now we're going to dive into what we can do with our reagent system to avoid possible side reactions that might take place. We've got two main categories of these side reactions that are caused by methanol and side reactions that are caused by iodine. So as you'll remember, again, Karl Fischer, there's a chemical reaction taking place. If our sample is reacting with any of those portions of the Karl Fischer reaction, then you're going to be influencing the ultimate water and iodine stoichiometry that's reacting at the end of that reaction mechanism. So again, two major categories here that are concerning are samples that have side reactions undergone with methanol. So the major categories that we see here are ketones and aldehydes. These will react to form ketols and acetols, respectively. but aldehydes have a much stronger reaction. They'll also undergo the bisulfite addition reaction in addition to the acetyl formation. We also want to be careful with amines as well as siloxanes. Amines will undergo methylation, while siloxanes will undergo esterification in the presence of methanol. In the iodine side reaction category, we want to be careful about halogenated hydrocarbons, and then any mercaptans and phenols and peroxides as well. Again, anything that's going to be interacting with something that's critical for our Karl Fischer reaction might be at the end of the day impacting the selective reaction with water, giving you not a true reading when you're getting your final result. First, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the ways that we can control and avoid these side reactions that undergo with methanol. So we're going to focus mainly here on aldehydes and ketones, which were the first two categories that we mentioned on the previous slide. These two sample types will react with methanol to form acetyls and ketols, respectively. This reaction forms water. So you can see this first reaction on the screen here. We have a ketone that's reacting with the methanol present in our reagent system, and that's actually forming water. And again, here we've got the aldehyde second reaction taking place on the bottom of the slide here that's using water. But any reaction that's taking place in our reagent system that is either forming or using water, then at the end of the day, that is going to be measured by our instrument, and that's not water that was originally present in the system. It's water that got formed from our sample reacting with the working media itself. So what do? Do we just say, okay, we can't measure ketones and aldehydes? No, luckily we do have some reagent solutions that we can use here. Generally, we recommend going with either methanol-free or, as I mentioned, we recently released some completely alcohol-free reagents. These are what we'll recommend using to avoid and suppress these side reactions as much as possible with ketone and aldehyde samples. So there are choices that we can use both on the volumetric side as well as on the coulometric side. On the volumetric side, you're going to be wanting to use any working media that's part of the Hydranal K series. So basically this is methanol free, gives you some different options that will suppress these side reactions. Be aware that they don't disappear completely, but they are greatly suppressed, allowing you to get an accurate water content reading. And on the coulometric side, we'll be looking again at the K series or at that new completely free of alcohol series for the best possible ketone analysis. Again, these side reactions are suppressed. It's impossible to completely eliminate. So especially on the coulometric side, we want to be cognizant of the amount of sample that we're using. Limit the sample size wherever possible. Size your samples to not make them too large so that you don't overpower the system. Okay, we're going to jump now to our other side reaction category that can take place. This is side reactions that take place with iodine. There's a really quick way that you can test your sample to see if it has any iodine reactivity. Just simply dissolve a couple of iodine crystals in methanol and introduce your sample. If your solution changes color, if it turns clear, that is, it's clear that there's an iodine reaction taking place. When you dissolve those couple of iodine crystals, you're gonna have a nice yellowish, orangish color working media there. If you inject your sample, turns clear, something's happening to react with iodine. What that could be is a halogenated hydrocarbon, could be a thiol, could be a phenol, or a peroxide. These will all interact with iodine, and as a result, you'll have water content results that are not indicative of the true water content that's present in your sample. For all of these on the screen here, we have lab reports available if you're interested in the exact details of what's happening for each of these samples, as well as the recommended way that you can avoid these side reactions. Okay, so we've covered sample solubility. We've covered possible side reactions that can take place and how we can choose the correct reagents to block them. Now we're going to talk about the pH of the sample and why that even matters. So what we have here on the screen is a chart of the Karl Fischer reaction rate, log K, plotted against the pH of the solution itself. And you can see kind of from 5 to about 7.5, we have a nice flat, consistent reaction rate that's quick, not going off at an extreme angle. This is really our ideal pH range that we want to always keep our working media in. If we're down at pHs below these, we're going to be having slower reactions, not ideal, obviously, from a productivity element. And actually, if we get down below pH of 2, the Karl Fischer technique will be suppressed completely, so actually no reaction will take place. You may be thinking to yourself, faster is better. Why don't I want to keep this basic all the time, increase this to pHs of above 7.5? But as we start to get too high, pHs above 8, 9, we actually have side reactions that take place that impact the water content determination. And so if you're too basic, you're going to be having water content values that are not reflective of what's actually in your sample, because you'll be undergoing side reactions that are impacting your reagents themselves. So again, rule of thumb, all of our reagents are buffered to be within that 5 to 7.5 range. So for a lot of samples, you don't need to worry about this. But we're going to dive a little bit deeper now into what do we do if we need to know the water content of either very acidic or very basic samples that once you inject them actually shift the range of the working media itself. So what do we do if we have, let's say, a very strong acid? We inject it into our titration cell. First of all, how do we test if there's a pH change going on? You can just use those really quick and easy pH papers. We've got a pretty decent sized range that we want to be within here. So, you don't need to make this an exact science. You're not shooting for pH 6.8 exactly. But when you inject your sample, if you suspect that you might be impacting the pH of your total working media with it, just do a quick pH paper test. See how you end up. So now let's say we've got a strong acid. Let's say we've dropped our pH very, very far. We're close to that 2 where no reaction is taking place. What can we do? There's a couple of different things that you can do. Again, summarized here just by titration technique. You can always use imidazole as a great neutralizing agent for our strong acids. If you want to save time, again, there's some pre-mixed solutions available as well, both for volumetric and for coulometric. You can use buffer for acids, which just has that imidazole premix to the recommended ratios with the rest of the Karl Fischer components. For coulometric cells with a diaphragm, we don't recommend using that buffer for acid, but you can always add imidazole in directly to shift that pH back up to exactly where you want to be, 5 to 7.5. We have similar options that we can do on the basic side of things. So again, if we have a sample that's extremely basic, we might be pushing that pH out above that recommended 5 to 7.5 range. We might be starting to see some side reactions going place, impacting the iodine content of our reagents. In this case, we can use either benzoic or salicylic acid. We can also use a premixed media as well, a buffer for bases. Again, thought process here is that we want to be moving that pH back down into the 5 to 7.5 range. And once again, we can use pH paper just as a really quick initial check if we're outside of that recommended range. If you do have further questions on this, we also have lab reports written for a lot of strong acid, strong bases samples, and we have some technical information as well with some further details, on procedures recommended for using imidazole, using benzoic acid if you don't want to use one of those premixed solutions to save time. Okay, last but not least, reagent category. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about safer reagents. So, I think it's no secret that we always want to be making our work in the lab as safe as possible. If we have solutions available to us to shift to safer equivalents that don't impact the performance, I think we want to be considering those. So when we're talking about this, we're thinking about, if possible, alternatives to methanol. Methanol is fairly toxic, so you have options to shift to ethanol-based reagents if that's something of interest to your lab. Another category here is CMR substances, particularly impactful within the European Union as it's a European Commission restraint. We always want to be avoiding any CMR classified substances in our work in the lab. Anytime that we can avoid a cancer risk, mutagenic risk, or of course reprotoxic risk, we want to be doing so. So within the Hydranal line, there are some imidazole-free, which are completely CMR-free reagents that'll allow you to eliminate those risks from your work. There are options for these for both general samples as well as actually ketone samples themselves too. So for a lot of our sample types, we'll be able to completely remove CMR risks, which is great. We stay on top of monitoring those lists very closely, and we're always keeping our reagents as safe as possible. Last but not least, I know I mentioned in our co-solvent sample that chloroform can be a really great co-solvent. It's also a bit of a toxic chemical that we want to avoid if possible. So we do have premixed co-solvent systems that are chloroform free. That'll still be as good of co-solvents, but will eliminate that chloroform risk. If you don't need to expose yourself to it, why expose yourself to it? So if any of these are sort of interesting topics, I know one of the handouts that DDA included helpfully in this section is our imidazole-free reagents. That'll give you a little bit more information on these CMR-free reagents in particular. Any other safer lab types of inquiries, always feel free to reach out to us anytime. We've got recommendations that can help you in this area. Okay, and last but not least, sort of within the overall reagents family, the last thing that I would be completely remiss if we didn't talk about in terms of getting the most out of our Karl Fischer titration is how do we actually validate our results? So how do we qualify that we are getting accurate results? We are doing as much as possible to really get a low RSD, good quality water content result. Well, we do this with water standards. What's the purpose of using water standards? Kind of twofold here. On the volumetric side of things, we recommend doing regular titer determination on your titrating agents. The reason that we do this is that we always want to be using the most accurate titer value that's reflective of what's currently in the bottle that you're using hooked up to your titration equipment. So it depends a little bit, how frequently you're running titrations on when we recommend doing titer determination. General rule of thumb, is a couple times a week. However, if Karl Fischer isn't a regular analysis that you're doing in your lab, we would just recommend anytime you're going in to do analysis. So let's say, you only run one check a week, maybe a couple checks a month. In that case, really anytime that you are running a new volumetric analysis, we would recommend running some titer determination as well, just to make sure your results are as accurate as possible. On both types of Karl Fischer titration, so volumetric and coulometric, we also recommend running frequent system checks using water standards just to validate that you're getting the recovery that you expect. We also have some reports available that run through this, as well as suitability tests and recommended procedures. The recommended procedures are actually within each of our water standard boxes as well. So really, really easy. You don't even need to go online. Just open the box. On the back of one of those little inserts, you'll have some step-by-step best practices to follow when working with water standards. And then finally, after you determine your water content in your sample, you can check the recovery of water using a water standard just to make sure that everything is running as expected and you can trust those results. The water standards, we recommend using. Some customers like to use just pure water. It's available in your lab pretty regularly. The reason that we really recommend using water standards as a best practice instead is just due to the sample size that you need to use when you're working with pure water versus the water standards themselves. So, water standards, you can get either 1% water, 5% water, 0.1% water, so really tailored to close to the actual sample size that you're using. And as you can imagine, you can inject a much larger sample size, which you can do much more repeatedly than using pure water itself, where we're talking about, you know, not even milligrams of sample, even micrograms of sample that we're trying to inject. And that can just make it a lot harder to get a really tight RSD on those results that we're using. Again, water standards themselves could really be just an entire webinar. So this is just kind of a quick and dirty, some general rule of thumb to keep in mind. If you're interested in more information, we do have a ton of documentation on water standards themselves, as well as I mentioned, in each of those individual boxes, you'll have a really helpful just rules of thumb and procedures to follow when working with them. Okay, and so now on to the recap here. What have we learned today? So we've learned about the things that we need to consider to be getting the most out of all of our Karl Fischer titrations. By that, we mean we're going to need to be thinking about our water content and how much accuracy that we need when choosing between volumetric and coulometric techniques. And then there's several things that we're going to need to consider to make sure that the results that we're getting are reflective of the true water content of the sample. So we're going to need to consider solubility. We learned that we can work with different co-solvents as well as having some other methods available to us to maximize the solubility of our sample. We learned that certain samples will undergo side reactions with portions of our Karl Fischer reagent system and how we can block some of those using different reagents. And we also learned about the importance of pH and that the Karl Fischer reaction takes place between pHs 5 and 7.5. And so we may need to buffer to keep the proper pH for certain samples. We learned about how to keep our labs a little bit safer, some options that we have there, and then just barely dipped our toe into how we can validate those results using water standards to qualify them. Now, this was a ton of information, and I know I teased a little bit more information on some of the other topics that we didn't even have time to cover here today. In addition to the Aventur resources, you can always email hydranal@honeywell.com directly or visit our lab report database on our website itself. We have material available in English widespread, some German material, as well as even some Chinese material available. You can access these recorded webinars and everything as really great resources as well. And then we do have a dedicated Karl Fischer technical support team. This is the team that's located at our Center of Excellence in Zelza, Germany. Many of you may have already reached out to the great folks on this team to ask questions. If there's anything that comes to mind, please feel free to email hydranal@honeywell.com at any time with any type of question, and someone will be happy to help you out. And with that, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. I will hand things back over to Didier for the wrap up.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you very much for this complete and really professional webinar presentation. So I've seen that we have received some questions, and I would like to ask you, Allison. The first question from Germany: Can I use pure water as a water standard?
That's a really great question. So you can use pure water as a water standard. I mentioned a little bit. We do have some customers who prefer to use this, but it's really not recommended. And the reason for that is just you're going to need to use such small quantities of water that we would really recommend using one of our water standards that has a dedicated amount of water in it. Each of them will come with a COA that shows you, down to several decimal points how much water is actually present in it. It's certified. Every single batch is certified. So you're really getting the true water content, and you're able to use much larger sample sizes when you're working with a water standard versus with pure water itself. Hope that answers the question. Very good question.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. Another question. I think it's for coulometry. Can I use a nanolith in the cathodic compartment of a cell with a diaphragm?
Very good question. No, this is not recommended. So you can technically use the analyte in the cathodic compartment. You will still get decent results. However, as I mentioned, the catholates have a slightly different composition that is more resistant to some side reactions that take place at that cathode. So if you're using an analyte in the cathodic compartment, you're going to be needing to do very frequent changes of that reagent, which is just time consuming to change the reagent, as well as time consuming to wait for a stable drift to come back down. And you're not using a reagent with a composition that's optimized for that use. So we would recommend using catholates always in this case. Very, very dry to prevent some of those side reactions, slightly different, slightly less sulfur dioxide in them to prevent some of the side reactions. And they're actually packaged very similar to our water standards. So in the simple, easy to use, pre-notched ampules, you'll just use one per cathodic compartment. And the capacity is quite high of them. So good question. In general, no, not recommended to use an analyte in the cathodic compartment of a cell with a diaphragm.
Allison, we have another question concerning the pH. You mentioned the pH parameter during your webinar. And the question is the pH range for every hydranal solution type the same?
Good question. So the pH range of all of our reagent systems, except for those specific buffer systems, is buffered to be within that 5 to 7.5 range so that they're ready to use right out of the bottle. Again, we have a couple of different buffer solutions that are premixed that are made specifically for working with those strong acids or strong bases. And so those, will be buffered either a little bit or higher or lower because they're meant to be used specifically with samples that are shifting the pH. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it was okay. I try to see if we have other questions. Yeah, maybe we can write the question and we can bring the answers later. Okay, so Allison, thank you very much. And I would like to tell a big thank you also to Apova Parimal from your company because she has organized this webinar. Florence Valentin from Aventor as well has made the complete organization for this webinar. And before moving to the end of this webinar, I would like to add different things. So concerning the brochures, you know that in this screen you can see documents, and I've loaded 4 different brochures. The complete brochure for the hydranal reagents, a complete brochure with question and answers, the complete brochures for some special water determination, etc., etc. So feel free to download these brochures, or you have another way. You know that we have a website, and in the featured solution you have chemicals, and you can go in the research by brand. You will find Honeywell, and you will be free to find all the different brochures, the different product, the different ranges, etc., etc. Okay, so feel free to do that. And after that, I would like to give you some details. So tomorrow you will receive the recording of this webinar. So I think it's important for you to know that, because you will be able to share this webinar with your team, with your colleagues, because personally I think that this webinar is really helpful for this method. Another point is that just after the webinar you will receive a study. Feel free to give us your feedback for this webinar, because it's still important to know your opinion. We want to improve that, but it's really important to know your opinion and your notes on different points. Okay, after that, in 1 week, so next week, you will receive a complete newsletter, a follow-up mail with additional points, with again brochures, ranges, link to the website, etc., etc. I'm sure that you will be really interested by that. And after that, so I think that I can tell you, thank you for your attention. A big thank you to Allison for this great and complete webinar. I've just Yeah, just I can see. We have other questions, but honestly, we have many questions, and we will have no time to bring all the answers. So I will send you a complete table with all the answers to your questions, and I'm pretty sure that all the audience will be interested by these answers. Okay, so thank you very much. We will finish. We are finishing in advance, and yeah, I would like to wish you a great evening, and I hope that this webinar will interest you very much. Okay, thank you again, and thank you, Allison, for your great webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.